Hello. I will now speak following the recent speeches by Professor Avisagi and Dr. Shaul Arieli, who eloquently presented the grave national religious doctrine of Abraham Isaac HaKohen Kook and his son Zvi Yehuda Kook, as well as the manifestation of these doctrines by the current ruling coalition of the State of Israel. Both Shaul Arieli and Avi Sagi express deep concern for our fate as a result of these current trends in the ruling coalition. But in my view, they, Avi Sagi and Shaul Arieli, limit themselves only to presenting the ideas of these founding fathers of religious nationalism, ideas that are not accepted by the moderate majority, without attempting to show the ultimate outcome of the influence of these ideas on the fate of the State of Israel, or to point out the reasons for the spread of these ideas, or to indicate ways to neutralize these ideas by creating effective alternative platforms in the consciousness of the country's residents. Professor Menachem Fish, in his book The Zionist Revolution and Its Internal Opponents, talks about the need to address national religious Orthodox Jews in the language of their own religious concepts in order to encourage them to stop supporting the self-destructive tendencies of religious nationalist Judaism. Professor Avisagi also speaks about this need, while Dr. Shaul Arieli shows secular Jews the main difficult ideological emphasis of the Orthodox movement of Abraham Isaac Kook and his even more radical son Zvi Yehuda Kook. But it follows from this consideration that the destructiveness of the ideas of the Kook family and their enthusiastic disciples is evident to all, without any need for further explanation. As our situation with the current government coalition shows, this is not the case. I will attempt to present the teachings and policies of Rabbi Kook and his son, translated into the language of secular liberals, in order to complete the full length of the bridge that must be stretched across the chasm between modern secular liberal Judaism and the radical religious nationalists who were raised on the teachings of Rabbi Kook and his son. Such a bridge must help, and ideally should help, secular liberals from the center-left in Israel to understand the deep ethical, strategic, and especially metaphysical advantages of their views, and to make both them and their opponents feel the true weight of the liberals against the terrible tendencies of the religious nationalist extremists. Liberals' reluctance to engage with metaphysics due to the horrific behavior that metaphysical terminology provokes among religious extremists prevents liberals from recognizing the metaphysics of liberalism and its power. My task requires me to embark on an extraordinary journey along the timeline, back and forth, again and again, and I ask my listeners not to get annoyed with me because of this. In my remarks, I will say many things that are common knowledge. My mission is to find ideas that will save us from the constant dreadful slide into religious nationalist self-destruction. Although I am directly addressing my heartfelt words to my dearest friends, my beloved loved ones, and my cherished relatives, I clearly and fully understand that my practical suggestions and proposed solutions can only be effectively implemented by dedicated people who are well organized into powerful political forces. I hope that my words will reach these people. I will express my thoughts in the form of relatively short verses, in the hope of achieving maximum clarity. My goal is to try to provide the residents of Israel with a liberal mindset, compelling and inspiring arguments for creating a collective center of attraction for people who, for now, identify with the religious nationalist camp. So here is a presentation of the reality of reality following my words and the words of Shaul Arieli and Avisagi, along with some of the necessary explanations for further formulating a convincing alternative platform. Mr. Netanyahu's government, with ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Ms. Struk, resorts to vulgar and violent populism, which provides it with a stable coalition majority. This majority demands the dismantling of the rule of law, which is based on equality of all before an independent judicial system, and the dismantling of social forces that are the mainstay of the state's strategic strength. Later on, I will explain why this populism succeeds, even though many on the left claim that such an explanation is unnecessary because it is self-evident. I believe it is essential to explain this. The center-left is appalled by the path the ruling coalition is taking the country down, but they are unable to convince the coalition supporters to stop supporting it and switch to the opposition. This happens for two reasons. First, because the supporters of the ruling coalition are convinced of the need for a monolithic society, that is, a society united as a fist, fully mobilized ideologically for the sake of a crushing, forceful victory over the enemies of the people, and in the effectiveness of this approach. And also because the ruling coalition uses the terminology of Rabbinic Judaism, which serves as the basis for self-identification for most Jews in the country. Even people with secular inclinations, in the absence of other sources, also religate reluctantly in the concepts of Orthodox Rabbinic Judaism. Israelis from the center-left are appalled by the destructive influence of the ruling coalition on the basic humanity and fundamental justice within Israeli society, which in the past ensured the personal, intellectual strength of many Israelis. It is precisely this intellectual strength that the State of Israel has relied upon in ongoing regional conflicts and in its successful participation in the global economy. It must be recognized that the influence of the ideas of Abraham Isaac Kook and his sons V. Yehuda Kook in Israeli society stems from three complementary sources: the dominance of religious concepts in Jewish self-consciousness, the absence of a liberal theological foundation for the idea of the State of Israel, and the tremendous institutional support given to the Kook rabbinical family and their yeshivas by the British Mandate authorities during the two decisive decades of the establishment of Zionist society in the land of Israel. To this was added the decisive impetus of the early secular Zionist leadership under the authority of David Ben-Gurion to subordinate its ideals to the views of the Orthodox followers of Rabbi Kook, the father. The commitment to accept Orthodox dominance in Israeli society was formalized in a letter from Ben-Gurion known as the Status Quo Letter, which was sent to the ultra-Orthodox because the secular Zionists alone were unable to convince the international community that they specifically politically represented the Jews' right to a national state in the Middle East. The secular Zionists understood that in the eyes of the international community, which determined the fate of the State of Israel in the years 1947, 1948, it was not they, but the Orthodox Jews. They were the true symbols of the Jewish people. The commitment to preserve the Orthodox character of social life in the newly established State of Israel was meant to convince the international community to support its founding. As a result of these processes, concepts such as redemption, holiness, Shabbat, the 613 commandments, purity, laws of personal status, and kashrut began to gain increasing importance at the center of public consciousness. This was not the case previously in secular Zionist society. This happened against the backdrop of the fact that until Zionism flourished in the 1930s, the secular Zionist majority of Jews had already lived for 2 generations in complete separation from Orthodox education and Orthodox prescriptions and rules, and did not attribute importance to their deeply problematic essence. This majority grew up within the framework of state liberal education and vocational training in their countries of dispersion. There were reasons for Jews leaving life within the framework of rabbinical religious orthodoxy. Already at the end of the 18th century, the first generation of Jews with a high university education emerged in Central Europe. After the famous Edict of Tolerance in 1782 by the Austrian Emperor Joseph II, they were accepted into government positions and experienced the power and security of the new opportunities that opened up before them, as well as the deep satisfaction of the intellectual respect they gained through their education. Moreover, the traditional Orthodox communities now began to benefit from the material support of these Jews who held high social and economic status. As a result, many of the remaining Jews followed in the footsteps of these enlightened members of their generation. Against this backdrop, the tragedy of the Jews who were ruled by the Orthodox rabbis became apparent. It was now clear that rabbinic rule was a form of severe intellectual and epistemological oppression, whose very essence, it is hard to overstate, was the infliction of a kind of mental mutilation upon the members of their insular communities. In fact, this amounted to a deliberate concealment from Jews of the ways to develop knowledge about the real world. In theological terms, this is referred to as knowledge of creation. This was done out of a determined desire to preserve the rabbis' communal power as a guarantee for maintaining the purity of the helpless Jews in anticipation of the coming of the Messiah and their magical overnight transformation into all-powerful people without acquiring education or advanced professional skills. This was done out of the rabbis' fervent self-conviction that the regime they maintained was a commandment of God. It was done as part of cultivating wishful thinking, which they instilled and presented as faith in God, but in essence it was at its core a castration of the intellectual power granted to people according to the theses of classical biblical Judaism. At its core, this was a new kind of idolatry. It was a substitute for honoring creation and an intolerant demand for the fulfillment of applause and desires without years of sublime human effort. The collapse of rabbinic influence among the Jews would have occurred earlier if the countries of Europe had enacted laws to integrate Jews into their civil systems. But these laws were only adopted starting at the end of the 18th century. It was then that a few individual rabbis, shocked by the inhumanity of the Orthodox mindset, called for general education for all Jews, and for this they were angrily condemned by most of their Orthodox colleagues. Among these brave individuals were Moses Mendelssohn, Naphtali Herz Wesley or Weisel, the Vilna Gaon Elijah, Samson Raphael Hirsch, and Abraham Geiger. The Vilna Gaon's calls to broaden Jewish education to include general human knowledge were carefully concealed by his successors. The vitality of Orthodoxy and the Orthodox rabbinical governance of the Jews was based on the simple fact that all basic, and in fact the only communal education that Jews received was under the guidance of the Orthodox rabbis themselves, who exercised a regime of strict authoritarianism, which, against the backdrop of concealing general education, acquired the magical power of representing the eternal divine truths. From the call to know the world as the commandments of the Hebrew Bible, the Jews became a sect for whom knowledge of the world turned into a sin before the Creator. Their departure, the Jews' abandonment of rabbinical community governance in the early decade, equipped them with alternative doctrines of reformed and enlightened Jewish thought. These were formulated by rabbis such as Abraham Geiger and Leopold Zunz, and as a result, a significant portion of these Jews, who had meanwhile emigrated from Germany to the United States, came to rely on these ideas and to thrive both civically and personally. These were people who had almost no folkloric material for Jewish self-identification except for the songs of European Jewry. Against this backdrop, the Orthodox not only remained the gatekeepers, the custodians of Judaism, but from now on were also filled with pride in their distinctiveness. The pride of the ordinary members of Jewish Orthodoxy was guided by the Jewishness of their leaders, the rabbinic leaders. This pride served as a powerful barrier that protected the lack of orientation of the Jews who remained within Orthodoxy, effectively turning them into beings lacking ability, with a corrupted consciousness regarding their very basic existence. Meanwhile, in Europe, since the end of the 19th century, a tragedy was unfolding. With the general democratization of society, the political weight of the common people, the plebeiansor in collective terms, the plebs increased, along with the ability to rely on their votes to attain power and to hold on to it permanently by people who themselves are poisoned by the anger of their own inferiority. Populism is a manipulation of the consciousness of the plebeians. Many among those with a plebeian mindset are characterized by bitterness over their inferior existence, by impatient impulsiveness driven by emotional urges, by wishful thinking and wishful tinkering, by a tendency to chase after mental shortcuts, by a propensity for excessive generalizations, by dreams of revenge against anyone they perceive as successful, by a search for leaders capable of uniting the people into a vengeful force, and by a longing for a thrilling, almost mythical revenge to compensate for their grim reality. Such moods completely free people from the usual constraints of interpersonal politeness and social niceties, while giving those who experience them a deep and profound sense of corrective justice, as if a natural balance is being restored. This forms the basis for carrying out the most horrific mass murders in human history. Hitler's Nazis. Hitler's Nazism was by its very nature a product of the plebeian consciousness, and for this reason it was not limited by any human boundaries. The caricature of restorative justice held by the German plebeians was shaped by Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler above all humanity. This kind of restorative justice turned out to be a force capable of extinguishing people's consciences. Gypsies, homosexuals, and above all Jews fell victim to the dregs of humanity. Nevertheless, it is not surprising that the Nazi regime of murderers, although it relied on the power of civilization accumulated before their rise to power, exhausted its potential within 10 years and was defeated by forces that preserved and increased the strength of liberal civilization. First and foremost, the strategic power of the United States of America and democratic Britain. It should be understood that the consciousness of the plebs has been embedded in Judaism since biblical times. In fact, this is the core of the Jewish people's narrative. The first part of the biblical stories is a tale of overcoming the self-destructive influence of plebeian emotions and of the gradual creation and establishment of a reasonable state existence with a minimal number of casualties. The second part of the biblical narrative tells of the complete distortion of the state's structure in the spirit of the treachery, cruelty, arrogance, and narrow-minded plebeian attitudes of the Jewish rulers and of the collapse of the first three states, the kingdom of David and Solomon, the kingdom of Israel, and the kingdom of Judah. But it is precisely that part of Jewish history which begins in the last books of the Bible, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, and is preserved even more strongly in later sources that shows the full horror of the prevalence of plebeian sentiments at all levels of the Jewish hierarchy, especially after the return from the Babylonian exile of people with a plebeian mindset, who now, by virtue of the imperial Persian mandate, saw themselves as the ideological leaders of Judaism. Since then, the plebeian consciousness has become the spiritual foundation of Judaism. The Ten Commandments of Moses, intended for life in an organized, harmonious state society, remained outside of Jewish consciousness. Instead, the main focus became the observance of rituals and a tendency toward fantasies of vengeful fanaticism at every turn. Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. The situation worsened after the destruction of the Second Temple, when, with the help of the Roman occupying authorities, the management of Jewish consciousness fell into the hands of people who had never been involved in running society, led by Yohanan ben Zakkai and Rabban Gamliel. Under their leadership, a vast number of folk legends began to be written down, what is known as the oral Torah, which had previously been forbidden to record in writing due to their fantastical nature, and now constitute an enormous corpus of legends sanctified by plebeian religiosity. The study of this corpus and the behavioral rules derived from it became a powerful tool of consciousness, so much so that neglecting awareness of the strategic reality of existence became a sinful anti-Jewish preoccupation. The world that opened up to the Jews after 1800 years of misery, persecution, and mass murder generation after generation, they rose up against us to destroy us, constituted a cultural shock for educated Jews. alongside the knowledge about the world and the possibilities for applying it, for the benefit of the collective, their plebeian consciousness began to fade. For 200 years, educated Jews of Europe acquired the skills necessary for taking responsibility for public administration at the middle level of the governmental hierarchy. But before the Holocaust of European and Libyan Jewry, they did not develop a comprehensive theory of statehood of their own. Herzl's two influential books provided the Jews only with basic outlines for organizing a Jewish state. The Jewish state, as well as dreamlike, almost utopian images of the lives of German Jews who settled in the land of Israel, more precisely in the Galilee. Young Zionists at the beginning of the 20th century came to the land of Israel to live with spiritual dignity, but without a general theory of a new Jewish state. This was immediately noticed by the young rabbi at the time, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Hakohen Kook, who in his pamphlet Mamar Hador pointed out both the passionate joy of existence among the young secular Jews and also their ideological vulnerability to the main foundational principles of Jewish Torah in the spirit of the plebs, the orthodox, the destructive. Kook soon managed to convince the secular leadership of the Zionists that his desire to imbue Zionism with the spirit of orthodoxy would only grant Zionism the missing international metaphysical weight. The Zionists embraced Kook wholeheartedly, without realizing that they were subordinating the Zionist project of saving the Jews to the guidance of a doctrine laden with destructive plebeian positions. Meanwhile, in Europe, almost at the end, since the end of the 19th century, two Jewish entities emerged. The secular Jewish people, politically dispersed, made up of professionals and university graduates, freed from the epistemological oppression of the rabbinate on the one hand, and on the other hand, yeshiva students and religious officials concentrated around the rabbis and the Orthodox themselves. The two entities coexisted in mutual rejection of one another, at the same time mutual relations with each other, while also maintaining a relationship of mutual parasitism, and simultaneously in relations of mutual parasitism. In the absence of historically acquired cultural territorial symbols, the professional Jews, the university educated, dispersed individuals needed elements of identity in the eyes of the nations among whom they lived, and these were provided to them by rabbinical groups who lived among the professional Jews and were funded by them. And so it turned out that in the eyes of the entire world, these two entities were perceived as a single whole, even though both were influenced by ideas that contradicted each other, and in fact, they hated one another. The sociopathic atmosphere surrounding the Jews, including among the Jews themselves, radiated outward and fueled the demonic anti-Semitic leaders of the European plebs even before Hitler. Therefore, the need for the Jews to separate themselves and establish their own state was already clear to many by the end of the 19th century. However, as mentioned, the establishment of a Jewish state encountered an internal Jewish problem. Although Herzl and his associates called for the establishment of a Jewish state as citizens with a cosmopolitan outlook among the subsequent Zionist leaders and among their British patrons, a tendency developed to recognize Rabbinic Orthodox Judaism as a central element in the matter of re-establishing the Jewish state in the land of Israel. In other words, the failure to understand that Orthodox Judaism had in fact degenerated into an anti-social sect that degraded the human essence of its people led to the royal elevation of this group within the Zionist project. What later became clear was that the disciples of Abraham Isaac Kook and his sons V. Yehuda Kook who were raised in authoritarian yeshivas organized with the help of the British, assumed their role in Zionism as its spiritual leaders, who, in the name of God, now send Zionist soldiers to wars and to their deaths, in the name of what they imagine to be God's commandments, known only to them, without any understanding on their part of the true strategic situation surrounding the State of Israel. A recurring situation gradually developed the process of self-destruction in which the devoted disciples of the Cook family persistently demanded the expansion of Israel's borders, called for ever greater efforts from the state, and rallied it behind a determined military effort. In their view, expanding borders is the binding will of God. In their view, military defeats are an expression of God's wrath over insufficient religiosity. And in their eyes, voluntary territorial compromises are a crime of desecration against God, whose punishment is unconditional death at the hands of Jewish avengers. This was the motive for the assassination of our Prime Minister Rabin of blessed memory in Tel Aviv in November 1995. The plebeian wretchedness of this worldview, the reduction of all phenomena to static ahistorical states, the refusal to understand the historically accumulated energies and actions of talented individuals, and the display of complete indifference to the personal fate of the Jews. At its core, this is a diabolical degeneration of the great ideas once held by Moses, our teacher. And now Israel finds itself in the same situation as so many times throughout Historia, sect of soulless people who have suppressed their personal conscience. They have struck a deal with an ambitious charlatan leader and are pushing Israel toward victories over the eternal enemy, Amalek. Regardless of the blood that is shed, and regardless of the fact that an eternal enemy cannot be defeated. And in a state of ecstasy, it promises the imminent arrival of complete redemption while refusing to explain what the concept of redemption actually means for all the Jews who yearn for form. The people of Israel, those with center-left tendencies, now face a single task: to free themselves from the symbiotic parasitism in their relationship with Orthodox Judaism, to reject the bitter central component that nourishes its plebeian foundation, and thereby open the door to a calm contemplation of constructive collective survival. To that end, it is necessary to understand the social and psychological essence of the concepts of redemption and sanctification of the name in their bitter, plebeian, and deep-rooted sense. Bitterness has always accompanied the Jews ever since the original story of Moses, our teacher. And even though Moses himself, due to his high status, was not affected by it, the Jewish bitterness, the bitterness of the Jews, is documented in the Bible and is indirectly explained there as well by their status over hundreds of years as humiliated slaves in Pharaonic Egypt. But an even more important and significant component in this context is the statistical condition of the Jews. The Jews were too numerous to exist as vassals within any ancient imperial structure, and too few to establish an empire of their own. As a result, it was necessary to maintain a small, separate state, vulnerable to the great empires to the south and northeast, and these posed real and constant threats to the existence of a Jewish state. This was reflected in the persistent and exaggerated anxiety of the Jewish rulers, both the kings and the prophets of Israel alike. Naturally, the entire ancient Jewish society suffered from constant anxiety and ongoing bitterness. And this was later codified in the rabbinic corpus of the Mishnah and the Gemara, embedding psychological vulnerability in traditionally minded Jews regarding all matters of collective survival. Thus, in place of collective survival emerged the concept of Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live on, with its morally distorted psychological background, joy of survivors set against fate of brothers who perished. This is an anti-human joy in belonging to a surviving religious structure, with no concern for the causes of the collective death of the victims and without any compassionate identification with those who perished. Am Yisrael Kai, in its common sense, is the joy of liberation from compassion. This liberation is only possible if the people experiencing it are raised from infancy in an environment that encourages pride, the pride of sacrificing oneself to superhuman forces, which are essentially a phallic fantasy of destroying all the people of the world, people who are not close to them. The concepts of redemption and sanctification of God have an organic connection to the plebeian meaning of the living people of Israel. Redemption is in essence liberation from reality and from the need to recognize and confront it. Liberation from all restrictions, the limitations imposed by a person's conscience. This liberation reaches its peak in the joy of humiliation and the murder of the other, according to the biblical story of Abel and his murderer Cain. Sanctification of the name is, in its essence, the sanctification of the murder of man, in complete contrast to the story of the binding of Isaac. From the above, it follows that the strategic danger to the collective existence of the Jews stems from the bitter and deep-rooted plebeian interpretation of the ancient and well-known Jewish heritage, and from the political weight of plebeian bitterness among contemporary Jews. It is not enough to aspire to deprive Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews of the authoritative power which parasitically burdens secular Jews in Israel through social structures dependent on demi-yeshivas, educational programs, supervision of kashrut, registration and implementation of personal status laws, and political demands and coalitions in government that disregard human suffering. There is a need to formulate a conception of Jewish identity that connects the necessity for a liberal humanism that is considerate of every person in Israel or under the skies of Israel, with an awareness of the ancient, later, and even later, heritage of the Jews. Naturally, the process of developing this conception must take place in an atmosphere that rises above the bitterness of the public sphere and remain within the spirit of fair and thorough research conducted by several hundred inspired experts, and subsequently become the solid foundation for educational programs from all directions in the country. The foundation of this conception must be the understanding that the history of the Jews is a tragic history, one that is covered by slogans of proud, foolish, and inhuman joy of the survivors. As a result, the basis for Jewish self-awareness must be the need to study and understand the failures of Jewish political life, the failure of their kingdoms, the strategic failure, and the reasons for these failures, and the later inability of the Jews to develop a policy of collective, or at least communal, survival. Likewise, it is necessary to study the current state's inability to reduce the amount of bloodshed surrounding its existence and the terrible spread of the bitter and vengeful plebeian spirit among today's Israelis. It is necessary to understand why Israel's secular leaders failed to develop a culture of nobility among Israelis and instead became hostages to a destructive plebeian bitterness. This inability arose not only from their cultural heritage as most of them lacked a quality higher education, but also due to the hasty nature of the Zionist project. During the most difficult years of Nazism and the massive waves of immigration in the early and impoverished years of the state, instead of a smooth transition to a tolerant spirit, to good governance with long-term goals, the secular leaders continued to operate in a mode of urgent, short-term solutions, which brought the entire society back to an atmosphere of bitterness and intergroup hatred. For this reason, the old Orthodox ideas about divine intervention, formulated in familiar traditional Jewish religious language, began to return to a dominant position. Look at the situation in Shaz. In such an environment, the danger of collapse of the Jewish state and the threat of death to everyone ceased to arouse fear in people. They returned to an exalted self-alienation according to the dazzling formula: the people of Israel live. The lack of protection against social self-destruction became clear and conspicuous. There is no quick solution to the deterioration of most of the people into bitter and defeatist moods of self-destruction. But the absence of immediate treatment does not mean that the salvation project does not exist. It exists. It must be understood that the missing link in stopping the country's slide into self-destruction is a coherent system of concepts and ideas, structural ideas, that must be placed at the center of the public consciousness of the people in Israel. Therefore, it is necessary to adopt a document affirming the supremacy of the liberal state over all religious decrees and to gain popular support for the decisive status of this document. The ethical foundation of this document must be based on the principle of preservation of life for the people, from which derives the understanding that the liberal state is the best guarantee for safeguarding the nation and all its people. The document must include the inadmissibility of using the concepts of redemption and sanctification of the name in political discourse, and the reason for this must be explained. All public authority of the Orthodox institutions over the civilian population of Israel must be transferred to the responsibility of the Special Public Council for the Culture and Identity of Israeli Citizens, while accepting the supremacy of the liberal state as the highest public authority over the country's population. This council should be accorded a position of prominence among all the religious groups of Jews worldwide. Members of this council can be elected to serve a term of 3 years, following a publicly announced candidacy period of at least 3 years. This candidacy must be supported by recognized and consistent long-term work in the field of culture, that is, high culture owned by clear, proven, and demonstrable evidence of respect for all citizens of the country, thereby fully demonstrating the candidate's ability to honor every person in the nation and to be recognized as entirely free from bitterness and destructive incitement. And the final clause, the recommendation of this council must be accepted, which will then be issued as a high-level recommendation by all the authoritative bodies responsible for the social values of the Jewish people and of people of other ethnic origins living with them, with us. The recommendations of the council that will be established will not serve as a substitute for the law. They will serve as a moral signpost for the self-improvement of the people and for finding better solutions on the subject in our search for a just peace in our region. Thank you.